Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to explore IAM roles, a powerful feature of AWS Identity and Access Management IAM that allows you to grant temporary permissions to users, applications, and AWS services. By the end of this session, you'll understand what IAM roles are, how they work, and their key use cases. Let's dive in. Let's start with the basics. What are IAM roles? An IAM role is an AWS identity with specific permissions that can be assumed by users, applications, or AWS services. Unlike IAM users, roles do not have long-term credentials like passwords or access keys. Instead, they provide temporary security credentials that are automatically rotated. Here's why IAM roles are important. Temporary permissions. Roles provide temporary permissions, reducing the risk of long-term credential exposure. Flexibility. Roles can be assumed by multiple entities, making them ideal for scenarios where you need to grant access to multiple users or services. Security. Roles help you follow the principle of least privilege by granting only the permissions necessary to perform specific tasks. For example, if you're running an application on an EC2 instance, you can create an IAM role that grants the instance access to specific S3 buckets. Now let's take a closer look at how IAM roles work. Here's the process. Create a role. You create an IAM role and define the permissions it grants. Define a trust policy. A trust policy specifies who or what can assume the role. This could be an IAM user, an AWS service, or an external identity provider. Assume the role. The entity, that is user, application, or service, assumes the role, receiving temporary security credentials. Perform actions. The entity uses the temporary credentials to perform actions allowed by the role's permissions. For example, if you're running a Lambda function that needs to access a DynamoDB table, you can create an IAM role that grants the necessary permissions and assign it to the Lambda function. Now that we understand what IAM roles are and how they work, let's explore some key use cases. EC2 instances. Use IAM roles to grant EC2 instances access to AWS resources. For example, you might create a role that allows an EC2 instance to read from an S3 bucket or write to a DynamoDB table. Lambda functions. Use IAM roles to grant Lambda functions the permissions they need to interact with other AWS services. For example, a Lambda function might need access to an S3 bucket to process uploaded files. Cross-account access. Use IAM roles to grant users or applications in one AWS account access to resources in another AWS account. This is ideal for organizations with multiple AWS accounts. Federated access. Use IAM roles to grant temporary access to users who authenticate through an external identity provider, such as Active Directory or Google Workspace. AWS services. Use IAM roles to allow AWS services to interact with each other. For example, you might create a role that allows AWS Code Build to access an S3 bucket to retrieve build artifacts. To get the most out of IAM roles, here are some best practices to keep in mind. Use roles instead of long-term credentials. Always use roles to grant temporary permissions rather than using long-term credentials like access keys. Follow the principle of least privilege. Grant only the permissions necessary to perform specific tasks, reducing the risk of accidental or malicious actions. Regularly review and update roles. Regularly review and update your IAM roles to ensure that they align with your security requirements. Use role chaining. Use role chaining to assume multiple roles in sequence, allowing you to perform complex tasks with fine-grained permissions. Monitor and audit role usage. Use AWS CloudTrail to monitor and audit the usage of IAM roles, ensuring that only authorized actions are performed. IAM provide a flexible and secure way to grant permissions to your AWS services and applications, minimizing the risk of unauthorized access. That is a wrap on IAM roles and use cases. In the next video, we'll get hands-on and walk through the steps of creating and managing IAM roles in the AWS Management Console.